Forgiveness is a principle we are all familiar with. It is such a common concept that we often take its value for granted. Its archetypal fingerprint and impact is woven throughout culture, appearing in spiritual frameworks like the 12-Step Recovery Program for addiction, as well as in secular stories like the iconic film Good Will Hunting. We all intuitively understand the necessity of forgiveness, yet it remains one of the hardest behaviors to practice. In recent years, our resistance to forgiveness has become even more apparent. However, the idea of forgiveness as essential for both personal and collective well-being is ancient, with roots stretching back thousands of years. One of the most profound and ancient examples of the necessity of forgiveness is the biblical tale of John 8. In this story, Jesus is challenged by the Pharisees about a woman who was caught in adultery. They proclaim the law of Moses, stating that adultery is a crime punishable by stoning. Jesus responds, stating, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." This leads to the crowd gradually leaving one by one, confronted with this simple but very deep truth, that none are without sin. Eventually only Jesus and the woman remain. Jesus asks the woman whether she has been condemned. She says no, and he replies, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." In this tale, there seems to be a clue to a deep psychological truth about forgiveness and its transformative nature, yet its incredibly difficult barrier to entry. You're watching Archetypal Wisdom. Join me in exploring the symbolic truths and mysteries of humankind. Remember to like and subscribe. Now, back to the video. So let's explore this story from a psychological perspective. It begins with the claim of morality and righteous judgment. The people have condemned a woman for something they collectively know to be wrong. They want to punish her as they believe this is what is right in order to compensate for her wrongdoing. Yet what is offered to them is the freedom to punish provided they are totally innocent themselves. This is a truly remarkable idea and frankly a confronting one. What I find most remarkable about this is the very simple but powerful truth that the first step one must take in their journey of moral development is to face themselves. With this simple statement, the entire crowd is faced with a humbling truth that they have all committed sin of some kind. In fact, facing oneself is a core tenet of psychoanalysis and psychological healing and development. From a Jungian perspective, this would be the journey into the unconscious and the facing of the shadow. The shadow is all that which is repressed and feared within the psyche. For example, if we were taught as children not to express anger, we might later find ourselves judging others harshly for their outbursts. One of Jung's famous statements is that we must withdraw our projections. So what exactly does this mean? Well, the ego structure within each of us is essentially our conscious personality. It is the I in our story. Yet the human psyche is far more complex and nuanced than the conscious perspective. There is a wealth of emotion and psychic potential which lurks within the unconscious of each of us. The problem, however, is that this out of sight, out of mind philosophy doesn't quite work with what is unconscious. This is because the unconscious within each of us filters out onto the world around us. We unwittingly project our own unconscious feelings and thoughts onto the world around us. Think about a time you felt especially annoyed with a stranger for a simple look or unknowable quality, only to realize upon slight self-examination they reminded you of an old bully who you had completely forgotten about. Or perhaps you had an argument with your partner in which you exasperatedly stated, "Why do you always have to make me feel small?" realizing upon further examination that this is actually how your father made you feel all the time. Jung believed it was essential that we reclaim our unconscious projections so we can actually resolve them internally and not be destined to act them out in the world. So the biblical tale informs us that the first stage of forgiveness is to look within, to face oneself. So let's for a moment ground this process in a relatable plight, family resentment. Most people have experienced some kind of formative challenge in their childhood home, and of course, this is usually the most impactful in their life as it informs their outlook, relationships, and a way of engaging with the world. When an individual faces themselves in an honest way, they are confronted with the shadow of their personality. They are forced to reckon with everything that they find detestable and unacceptable which has been repressed within themselves. Now, facing oneself in the shadow is an important part of most processes of psychological development, but let's keep the focus on forgiveness. When one is embarking upon the great challenge of forgiving someone, in the confrontation with the shadow, they will often find within themselves remnants of the same traits of those who caused them pain in their formative years. Well, this brings us to the real heat of the challenge. The rage one feels at those who caused formative wounds comes very naturally. But to then be faced with the ways in which we are actually similar to those who harmed us can feel fundamentally unacceptable. However, this seems to be a crucial part of the process of forgiveness, as the story of John 8 indicates. At the beginning of the story, the crowd are riled up and angry about the crime of the woman, yet are forced to recognize their own sinful nature, which then leads to the forgiveness of the woman and her opportunity to leave her life of sin. The tendency to judge others for their sin and to neglect the reality of our own is a classic dynamic of shadow projection. It is our tendency to not understand our unresolved formative wounds that are still influencing us and creating a divide of opposites within our own psyche. In fact, to contain a tension of opposites seems to be a natural function of the psyche. When one goes through a trauma, part of the psyche is split off as a way to cope. This means the conscious personality loses access to a function or trait, which is what the trauma actually is. The trauma has left the ego in a state of maladaptation. So, for example, say one grows up in an environment that is overly critical. The child feels like they are walking on eggshells, desperately trying not to set off the critical onslaught. Well, then this individual grows up to be very cautious, desperate to please others, and they have lost their own voice. Now, they might seek help due to the suffering this has caused them, and they might even be able to identify how they were wounded. But then as they dig deeper, they start to identify the deep anger that is bubbling underneath so many of their interactions. This feeling of anger is of course natural, because they have been robbed of their voice and thus their boundaries, and so they constantly feel taken advantage of. But then more devastatingly, they realize in their closest relationships they have actually become very critical themselves without realizing. Perhaps a friend or their partner opens up to them and tells them how they feel on edge around them. This is a hard feeling to describe. To reckon with the same traits within us that caused us so much pain. To see how we might have caused others a similar kind of pain that we have felt so deeply, even if it's less extreme. This can be thought of as the tension of opposites within the psyche. This swing between extremes, the desire to be overly nice but also finding oneself critical. The individual recognizes the ways in which they have been both the victim and the victimizer. This creates an extraordinary discomfort, yet one that must be felt and grieved. In the process of this, one recognizes that what they have done is wrong, and yet they also see the way in which they didn't mean to cause that type of harm to anyone else. In fact, they may have even been totally unaware that they were causing this harm. They were so consciously identified with their childhood experience of being victimized and needing to be the people pleaser that they had no conscious awareness of the anger that was filtering out. While this can be an extraordinarily painful experience, it leads to something very transformative: compassion. They start to identify a much more three-dimensional reality, which includes compassion for themselves and others as well as accountability. They start to see that both are needed in order to change. Instead of suppressing these opposites, they start to feel the messy and humbling truth of being human, which opens the doorway of forgiveness. In recognizing that they genuinely didn't mean or desire to recreate this pattern, they then recognize this same truth in the ones who caused them the pain in the first place. They too were part of some larger cycle of pain being recreated. In realizing this, the person can then grieve the pain that has been driving the painful cycles in their life. To use the example of the individual who grew up in the critical home, they can now grieve the pain of not feeling good enough and how this has led to a lifetime of trying to please others, and then how this resulted in repressed anger, which continued the cycle of criticism. If we look at this example through the lens of the biblical story, the pattern of criticism would be the sin they are confronting within themselves. This sin, in other words, is the dysfunctional behavior which goes against their conscience, that which they know to be right. However, the cause of this sin was actually a formative wound that was going unnoticed for so long and created a split in the psyche. The psyche's natural way of regulating itself and seeking equilibrium would be to try and compensate for this split, swinging between being overly nice with no opinion to overly opinionated and critical. However, if one can bear to face this pain and confront the way in which they have been both victim and victimizer, this is the first big step towards forgiveness and healing. As they grieve the complexity of this experience, they start to reclaim a sense of wholeness. That which was lost within them starts to become accessible, thus starting to heal the trauma. So if we return to the biblical story, after confronting the crowd with the reality of their own sin, the woman is not condemned by them, and so Jesus also doesn't condemn her. She is forgiven and once forgiven, she is instructed to leave her life of sin. With this in mind, if we return to the individual from the overly critical family who starts to contend with his grief and anger, he will start to reclaim what was lost, his voice. They are slowly integrating their anger into their conscious personality, their ego structure, and now they can voice their opinion at work instead of just trying to please everyone. In their rediscovered voice, they can set boundaries. Then in their close relationships, they no longer have repressed anger unconsciously spilling out in the form of continued criticisms. In other words, the process of going inwards led to humility and then a development of forgiveness which allowed them to leave their life of sin. This simple and short story has a profoundly deep symbolic truth about our own development of psychological healing individually and collectively. This is why this same motif of forgiveness permeates so much of culture. In the 1930s, the formation of the 12-step program was developed for alcoholics. It's important to note that at this point in time, no one knew how to help alcoholics. Doctors considered them doomed. The 12 steps emerged as a spiritual solution and have saved millions of lives since its formation. Step 4 is took a fearless and moral inventory of ourselves, and step 9 is made amends wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. These are two of the most difficult and impactful steps for many who work the program, and they map out the same motif of accountability and compassion. In other words, forgiveness. Or if we look at the classic movie Good Will Hunting, we can identify the same core motif. We see a destructive individual whose tremendous potential is trapped in unresolved issues and trauma, leading to a life of sin, so to speak. In his confrontation with destructive behavior and a sinful life, he is held accountable, much like in the story of John 8. Just like the crowd in this story, Will is eventually forced to look within himself and recognize his dysfunction. Will's therapist understands the messy and darker experience of being human. He personally understands the painful origins of Will's story, and thus instead of condemning him, compassionately understands the pain he is in and helps Will to recognize that the trauma isn't his fault. This compassion is held in the setting of accountability and addressing the responsibility to choose a better life now. This allows Will to grieve all the pain that has been behind his destructive cycles, and he is able to start leading a better life. He is able to leave his life of sin. It is well documented that forgiveness can reduce symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and also help physical conditions such as improving immune functioning and reducing health risks like hypertension. It appears we are living through a time where this archetypal truth has become less and less practiced and even less acknowledged, despite its palpable resonance within the collective psyche going back thousands of years. In the age of social media, it seems we have launched headfirst into shadow projection and casting the first stone. For example, it's common to see people online react harshly to others for small mistakes. This often reflects the unresolved anger or shame within us projected onto public figures or strangers. It seems clear, however, that in order for an individual and a collective to thrive, forgiveness is an essential ingredient. Human nature is incumbent on experiencing a certain amount of pain before being willing to confront oneself in all their difficult truth. This is the well-established case for addicts seeking recovery and individuals who seek out therapy, who need to reach a rock bottom before seeking help. It's understandable that we need to reach a certain level of pain to engage in this kind of work because it requires a deep level of courage and humility. However, just as the woman in John 8 was forgiven and told to leave her life of sin, forgiveness allows us to move forward, free from the cycles of blame, shame, and judgment. One thing that seems sure is that we can't survive without a pathway to forgiveness. You've been watching Archetypal Wisdom. Remember to like and subscribe. Stay wise.